In this video I create a BFG that goes pew pew, and I paint little ugly fat men with green paint. I'm the scale model geek, and in this video I rebuild a vehicle that I originally built about 30 years ago, and it's an Orc vehicle that I called the Nutcracker. I originally scratch built this vehicle from sheet styrene, balsa wood and some metal figures. This build was always a favourite of mine, so I thought I would challenge myself and redo this using all the latest technology at my disposal, such as 3D printers and a laser cutter. Originally I used very basic tools such as X-Acto knives, side cutters, thumb drills, and the hull was just the said styrene. I didn't have access to the amazing tools that I do now, so this challenge should be a lot of fun. I've been wanting to do this rebuild ever since I started this channel, so I'm finally getting my act together and diving in. In theory it should be far more detailed, so let's see how we go. Talking about laser cutters, this is the OMTECH Polar 350 that I have, and it's a 50 watt water chilled CO2 laser with a cutting area of 510 by 300 millimeters. This gives me plenty of room to be able to laser cut my design on a single sheet. With a cutting speed of 500 millimeters per second, I should be able to cut my boards within about 5 minutes. First thing I need to do is obviously design the vehicle in the provided software, which is Lightburn. These are the track wells, and I have the sides and the various pieces for the top of the wells. I've created the design so it engraves the name of each piece so I don't get confused during setup. This software recognizes the OMTECH laser cutter, so setup is at a minimal. Once I finish designing the vehicle, I then need to get it ready for cutting. First thing I need to do is adjust the height of the laser, and the way you do that is to take away the thickness of the material from the base height, which is 17 millimeters, and in this case the MDF is 3 millimeters, so we remove that from the base height, which gives us 14 millimeters. You then need to hit the height adjustment button for the change to take effect. Then I do a quick frame to make sure everything is aligned, and then I send the work to the laser cutter and off it goes to create my next masterpiece in MDF. When you cut timber with a laser, then you will get a lot of smoke, and the great thing about this unit is it has an exhaust fan that sucks out the smoke very quickly and efficiently. I've connected mine directly through USB, but the unit does also do wireless connectivity and also Ethernet. This feature is very handy when you can't have your PC right next to the laser cutter. These laser cutters are really a great addition to a workflow, and the majority of this build will be using wood instead of the usual plastic that I've become accustomed to. I was hesitant about using this new medium for model building, but after this build I'm now sold on it. Next, I've designed the hull and engine housing, and this will go between the track wells. I'll be also using some of this 1.5mm box board to create some steel straps for the hull of the vehicle. It took me a long time to find a material that was thin enough, and though in the eBay listing it describes it a chipboard, it's more like a dense cardboard. I almost ended up using acrylic for the project. Before we go any further, we do need to adjust the height of the laser to suit the box board, so we minus 1.5 millimeters from the height, which gives us 15.5 millimeters, and then it's off to get it cut to size. This OMTECH laser cutter is so fast, and especially on 1.5 millimeter box board. I did end up buying a variety of different thicknesses in the box board, so I'm ready for any challenges. Personally, I embrace any technology that's going to speed up and help me create my builds. I've never been scared of using technology, and the only thing that drives me up the wall is having to constantly learn new software for each new tool. I have a simple method, and that is, I just learn what I need to use as I go along. After all that, let's have a look at the results. These pieces have come up very nicely and with crisp edges. If I got my measurements correct, then the pieces should go together quite easily. For a change, I had the foresight to actually label the parts, so in theory I shouldn't have any issues with putting the parts together. The box board cuts have come up really nice and should add a bit of interest to the overall look once I paint them up to look like rusty steel straps. Since the laser can't do bevel joints, I'm going to have to file down the edges on the pieces to fit to the angles of the track wells. MDF is a soft wood, so it's not hard to get them to the right angle. Then a bit of super glue to hold them in place as the track wells start to form. The hull is effectively a big box with an angled front, so also very easy to assemble. I did run a bead of super glue on the inside just to give it that added strength. I originally wanted the vehicle to be rough and raw, just this huge, rumbling, monstrous and unstoppable menace destroying the landscape. There will be nothing pretty about this vehicle. The engine housing after assembly will be later attached to the rear of the vehicle. I cut up some of these strips from MDF and I'll use them as a fill in the joints just to avoid using too much putty on the angled areas. Once I had super glued them in place, I then filed and sanded the joints. The smaller holes I then filled in with putty. I'm more of a science fiction type of dude and prefer sci-fi hardware like they had in the movies such as Aliens, Blade Runner, and of course Star Wars. I like Lord of the Rings, but goblins, orcs, witches and wizards are not really my thing. Mind you, it is nice to step out of the box to create things not normally in my genre. The original Nutcracker that I built all those years ago has always been one that I had the most pride in building, mainly because 90% of it was scratch built, and something like that is very rewarding. Here I'm adding some MDF offcuts as spacers so I can work out the height of the hull so I can glue the track wells to the hull. Once I was happy with the height, I then super glued the wheel wells to the hull. Fortunately, I got them right on the mark first go. I also ran some super glue on the inside to give it more strength. The Nutcracker version 2.0 is coming on very nicely, and I'm loving this build so far. Let me know in the comments if there are some projects that you have wanted to revisit and redo. I have another project I would like to redo, which is a custom speeder bike that I made, and unfortunately the original has seen much better days. It's been slowly falling apart over the last few decades. The hull straps were super glued in place to give it the look that everything has been slapped together and held with rusty nuts and bolts. Speaking of nuts and bolts, these I created in Blender and then I printed up with my Elegoo Mars 5 Ultra. They are so small that they only took about 15 minutes to print up. I then went and glued a gazillion of them along the straps. I really like the look of them and quite an upgrade from the small punched out circles that I created on the original build. I've literally printed hundreds of nuts and bolts in various sizes waiting to be used in future builds. Off camera, I gave the hull an undercoat, and this is where I realised that it still looks a bit plain, so off I went and raided my mum's hobby drawer and stole a bunch of these diamond craft pieces to use as rivets along the hull, and yep, there were a gazillion more to stick to the hull, but seriously, well worth the effort. It looks far more realistic as an Orc vehicle can. Originally I was going to have the driver in that huge hole in the centre, and then I had an idea of putting an Orc driver in a cage right at the front with hydraulic cables hanging from the cage. To create the Orc I used an online app that I've used in previous builds called Titancraft. This site is geared towards the fantasy genre and gives you the ability to create all sorts of creatures. You select your character and then you compose it and add all sorts of goodies to the character. I imported my Orc driver into Blender and created my driver's cage around it. I designed that section so I could print the Orc separately from the cage. That whole process was actually a lot of fun to create. I imported those files into Chitterbox and printed the items with my Elegoo Mars 5 Ultra, which gave some very awesome details. I created a couple of brackets for the driver's cage with the OMTECH laser cutter and glued them to the cage. After I test fitted the cage to the hull, I realised that the Orc need a walkway to the driver's cage along the hull, so I also created that with the OMTECH laser cutter after designing it in Lightburn, and that was super glued in place. For the hydraulic cables, I'm using some of the wiring inside of this Ethernet cable that Gamey Builds had sent me for our collaboration in a previous build. These were perfect for the use I needed them for. These wires are a little more stiffer, so they give me the ability to pose them into place. To hold them into place, I'm using some UV resin from Let's Resin, and with a UV light it literally takes 5 seconds to harden, and those things are in there for good. They ain't going anywhere. I glued the cage to the hull and ran more super glue on the inside, and this area can't be seen, so it didn't matter if it got a bit messy. I bent the 4 pieces of twisted wiring and pushed them into their allocated holes, and that section I could call done. Now with the majority of the build done, it's time to start painting. I'm using some of this red from Vallejo, and I'm just going to give it a nice even coat. I then grabbed some of this Vallejo paint once again. This is red, and I'm going to give it a bit of a mottled finish to it. I'm trying to get an uneven quality to it. That way it kind of looks like a bit of wear and tear. And back to the Vallejo once again. This time I'm using the light red, and I'm just hitting the edges of the hull. And you can see this mottling type of style really gives it an aged look to it. I really like that finish. Here I'm painting those metal straps with some flat black, and it's right about here that I've actually realised, you know, it's probably best I dry brush the hull before I do those black straps. That way I won't get any red paint onto those straps. Now this again also adds to the wear and tear of the craft, or rather the hull. Then back to painting those straps black. With the base paint job done, let's start weathering it. I'm using some of this Vallejo wash, and that's the brown. I think it's the dark brown. And I'm just creating some streaks here and there, make sure it gets into all the nooks and crannies. Gets a good coverage of that. And you can see it slowly, step by step, it's starting to look a lot older, a lot grittier. I'm going to dry brush the whole area of those black straps with some gunmetal, and for that I'm using some of these golden maple dry brush brushes. These are really good, they're really nice brushes. Now we're giving this metal look to it right now, and then a little bit later we're going to add a bit more rusting to it as well. You need to have this type of dry brushing of the metal just to make it look like it's metal and not just, you know, black material. And there's a big skull on the front of the driver's seat or driver's cage, so we need to dry brush that. I did give it a coat of, I think it was beige, off camera. And time to do these tracks. Now I downloaded this, I think it's a Sherman tank or something, or I don't know what it is, but I really like the tracks on it, so I ripped out the tracks, did some modification, added that center structure there, so I've got a way of mounting it to my hull, and then printed it out. Now this was a long print, this one took a little bit longer. Now I'm adding some spaces here with some offcut of MDF, just so it sits better and a lot more level. For the paint job on the tracks, I'm just starting off with a base coat of flat black, making sure I get a nice good coverage of that. Then going back to the Vallejo red, and I'll do those side panels, those guards there. Once that's all dry, I then give it a bit of a wash with some of that dark brown from Vallejo again. And that's what it's looking like so far. It's getting there, still a couple more steps to go. Now I kind of thought, you know what, the hull needs some emblems on the side. So I created these pieces in Blender, then printed them out. And I dug up this very old tin of Model Master gold. I don't believe the company exists anymore. And you know what, it's probably the best gold I've ever used. It really gives it a great gold finish to it. Really like this gold, it's better than any of the other ones I used. Now a bit of blue tack there to hold it into place while I glue it into place. I just found it a lot easier to hold it with the blue tack rather than trying to use tweezers or something like that. A bit of weathering on there as well. I gave it a wash, then wiped most of it off. Now for the rust, a combination of the sepia and the pigment. Again, both from Vallejo. And using a piece of foam, oh no, it's actually sponge. Just dabbing it around the edges there. This is the first step of the rust. To glue the tracks onto the hull, I'm using some of this 5-minute epoxy resin, and that just gives me time for adjustments before it actually goes hard. 5 minutes is a fair bit of time. Now for the next step of that rusting, I'm using some of this AK pencil weathering streaking effects set, and I'm just hitting some of the edges with this, specifically the vivid orange. And this really adds a great touch to the rust, really brings it to life. I did end up toning some of that rust down with some black paint. I just went a bit overboard, but in the finished result you'll see it looks awesome. Now back into Blender, I created this blaster Just some basic shapes. Didn't take near that long. I don't know, I think maybe an hour and a half to create it. And then another, I don't know, 3 hours to print it, I think it was, on my Elegoo. I also created this exhaust system, or muffler, or whatever you want to call it, I don't care. And also printed on my Elegoo Mars 5 Ultra. Love that printer, awesome printer. Does some great results. One thing I noticed after I finished designing this blaster is that it actually moves from side to side, but it can't move up and down. I didn't put that axis in there, no brackets for that. Oh well. For the base colour of the exhaust, I think that was German red brown, and guess what colour this is? And I grabbed some metal dry brushing paint from Ammo, and using those golden maple brushes once again. Now it's time to make some scaffolding for those raging, crazy, hoarding orcs. Now they need somewhere to stand. I'm using, this time around I'm using 2.4mm box board. So it's a little bit thicker, and of course I used the OMTECH laser cutter for that. And it all comes together very easily because it's only just super glue that I need to use. And I'm kind of making this up as I go. I'm not really sure how the joints are supposed to work, but you know, if it doesn't work, scrap it and start again. It's cheap and easy to do. And it actually came out well, first go. Giving the whole thing a coat of Mod Podge just to seal the, well, it's actually cardboard, the reality is. And some of those diamond rivety things that I stole off my mother. Hope she's not watching this. Now to weather that decking, I use a bit of black wash and also a touch of that dark brown as well. Once it dries, it goes a lot lighter, as you can see there. And some light brown to dry brush and bring out the details. Now all that scaffolding gets a coat of flat black, exactly like the same as that strapping on that hull. Same technique. Here I'm using gunmetal from Ammo. They've got a dry brushing range, which is a really thick, very thick paint. Then super glued the decking onto that frame, and super glued the exhaust onto the hull, onto the engine housing. Looks good, I like it. This is some leftover handrails that I had from a previous build. And I didn't have to reprint or redo anything. They were perfect size for this job. It's just a matter of trimming it to fit the size of the decking. And this is the mast that's going on to the back of the trestle, scaffolding, whatever. Some jute that I don't even know why I have it, but I do. End up using this to strap it together. And a dab of super glue to hold that last piece into place. And then I just snipped it off. Here I'm just kind of, you know, distressing the timber a bit so it looks a bit older. Using that vivid orange once again from that AK set, the weathering pencil set. And look how good that looks. I'm really happy with that. And we need to attach a couple bolts to hold the mast into place. And I've done it on the other side as well. These are some towing lugs that I designed in Blender. I just thought it would be a really nice, interesting detail to add to the hull. It's time to make that standard that goes onto the mast. Now I found this outline of a torn, are they standards or flags? I don't know what they are. Which I thought was a really cool design. And in Photoshop I designed this fabric texture. And then added a yellow gradient to the bottom of it just to add a bit of interest. Threw in this round circle. And then created these checkered patterns to go on each side of that standard. And I found this vector file. It's available free from a vector site. I'll put the link in the description. And I thought it was just awesome. And for the flip side of the print, I just did one without any of the design, just the fabric. And this is what it came out like. Now I've already sealed this with a couple coats of clear varnish, so when I add the weathering it's not going to destroy the paper. And this is exactly the same technique I did in my previous build with that boat, that converted Messerschmitt jet. I love that technique so much that I thought I'd use it in this build. So with a very sharp hobby knife, I cut out this standard. Leave a comment somewhere, let me know what they're called, I don't know. And some masking tape to hold it into place, which I then painted red. I think this standard has come up really nice. Looks very, very nice. Ended up adding a bit of weathering to the bottom of it as well, because it looked a bit too cut. I want to add some cabling here. I've already designed the holes within the model, and for that I'm using some of this craft wire that I bought from Spotlight here in Australia. And this stuff's really cheap and it's super flexible, so it's really malleable. Great stuff. I've never used this stuff before. Really happy with this stuff. I can't remember if they had different gauges, but if they do, I'm going to buy some. A base coat of some flat black. And it got dry brush with some dark grey. I like it. And that pops straight in that big hole there a little bit later. But let's glue that scaffolding into place now with some super glue. And there's the blaster in place. Now currently it's not glued there, it's just sitting there at the moment. Now these are some ladders I've found on Thingiverse and didn't do anything to them other than print them up and weather them up. So let's get on to the base. Now this is some XPS foam, and for the textured surface, the cracked earth, I'm using some of this cork tiling that I've had laying around forever, that I've used in previous projects. Now this stuff is really tough to actually break. Probably because I think it's designed to be flooring, so you know it's pretty tough, like I said. Some PVA glue to hold it into place. Now you've got to be very careful when you do this section, because if you place your broken parts and you mix them up, they're not going to get together very nicely, or go together very nicely. So yeah, be careful. This took me about half an hour. Now let's get this blaster to go pew pew pew. Now I've run some wiring through the center of the barrels there. I'm using some of these 20mm LED filaments. To hold the filaments and the wiring in place, I've cut out these plug holes with the OMTECH laser, and look how fine a work it's done. Absolutely brilliant. And the wire just goes into that hole and the filament then gets glued into place there, and the wiring runs into that square hole. Little trick for you, on these filaments, the end that has a little hole in it is the positive side. Bit of super glue and also some baking soda, I believe it's in that little container, and that really glues it into place nice and solidly. And look at that, how good does that look? I like it. It actually worked. I'm always surprised when I work with electronics and it works. Now I need to create that puff of smoke, and the hairspray is basically to stiffen up the cotton wool once I've put it into place. Some very light sprays of that, and it goes really solid. Well, not solid, but you know, it's a lot stiffer. And look, looks good. How good does that look? Go on, you got to agree with me. That looks awesome. Coat of PVA glue over the base. And the reason we're doing that is we're going to give it a bit of a sprinkle of some of this grey tiling grout. Now, I've been using a lot of this in my last builds because I really like the finish of it. It looks great. A spritz of water just to help it harden up. It also had a bit of PVA glue in there. And that's what it looks like when it's all dried and solid, with the tracks that I've already created. A nice coat of the desert sand, just a light coat, then hitting the edges with some beige, and the center with some tan, just to vary up the color, make it a bit more interesting. Then I gave the whole thing a wash of some of that dark brown. just to unify all those colours. Now I need some bombs or missiles coming out of that cannon, so I found these on Thingiverse and I did some minor modifications to them. And they get a light coat of silver paint, and then what's that, a center paint of blue. Yeah, be very careful when you work with the filament because they are actually quite fragile, the LED filaments. I think we're now due for that story. The sun hung like a dying ember in the vast empty sky, casting its harsh light over a desolate, cracked wasteland. Nothing lived here, no trees, no animals, not even the wind dared to whisper across the barren plains. Only dust and silence stretched as far as the eye could see, broken by the distant silhouette of a monstrous moving thing, something too large, too twisted to be anything natural. It was a vehicle, if one could even call it that, a hulking, rusted behemoth made from the bones of dead machines, gears grinding and pistons pumping black smoke into the lifeless air. Its tracks were rusted and deafening, crunching through the brittle earth as it ploughed forward, unstoppable, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Atop this mechanical beast rode a horde of orcs, their green skin caked with the dirt of 1,000 miles. They were savage, wild-eyed, their massive bodies armoured with scrap metal, spikes, and trophies of bone. Each orc carried a weapon, blades chipped and rusted, hammers worn from countless battles, and rifles stolen from fallen enemies. They roared and shouted, their guttural voices rising above the roar of the engine, hungry for blood and chaos. Leading them was Grog, a warlord known for his brutality. He was the driver that stood at the front of the vehicle, controlling the massive vehicle and horde blaster. His scarred face twisted into a cruel grin as he surveyed the barren landscape before him. "Faster," he growled, his voice barely audible over the grinding of metal. He slammed his fist against the metal frame of the vehicle, pushing the beast to its limits. The engine roared in response and the vehicle lurched forward, spitting more smoke into the sky. The orcs cheered, banging their weapons against the rusted hull in savage excitement. Ahead of them, the landscape remained unchanged, an endless sea of cracked earth and dried riverbeds, stretching far into the horizon. But Grog knew their destination lay beyond the wasteland. For weeks they had travelled across this forsaken land, hunting, raiding, burning what little they found. The old world had died long ago, consumed by war and greed, leaving only fragments of its former glory. Grog's horde cared little for what had been. They only looked to the future, a future where they ruled. As the vehicle sped onward, it passed over the ruins of a long-forgotten civilization, crushed beneath its weight. Ancient pillars crumbled and shattered bones scattered in the wind. The orcs laughed at the destruction, taking joy in the desecration of what once was. Grog raised his axe high. "Tonight we feast, tomorrow we conquer." His words were met with a deafening roar from his horde, their bloodlust rising with each mile they travelled. Onward they drove, the earth groaning beneath the weight of the monstrous vehicle, and the horizon slowly turned crimson as the sun sank lower, casting the world in blood-red light. In the distance a faint glimmer appeared, a small, isolated settlement, unaware of the terror that approached. I really enjoyed creating this build and hopefully you enjoyed it as well, and also my little story. If you liked the video, Go and check out some of my other videos that I've got on this channel. Thanks for sticking around. I had fun. I'll catch you in the next one.